much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this policy exchange event. Today we are discussing the UK-EU relationship. Our title is Towards a New UK-EU Relationship, Making the Most of Post-Brexit Opportunities. I'm delighted to say we're joined by a fantastic panel of speakers. I'll do a brief introduction of everyone, and then we will move on to 3 to 4 minutes from each of the panelists, and then we'll open up to a Q&A from the audience. So firstly, we will hear from the Right Honourable Lord Frost, Minister of State for EU Relations, and has a wide-ranging portfolio across all the Brexit issues, including negotiating the trade agreement, the withdrawal agreement, and now in negotiations surrounding the Northern Ireland Protocol. The Right Honourable Arlene Foster, former First Minister of Northern Ireland, Martin McTague, Federation of Small Businesses, and Dr. Gerard Lyons, who is a Senior Fellow at Policy Exchange. So first things first, over to you, Lord Frost.
Great, thanks Stephen, and good morning, afternoon everyone. I think just a few points from me to kick things off. 5 points, sort of reflecting on where we are a bit and looking a bit beyond the Northern Ireland issue. I think first point, looking more broadly, we left the EU with what people like to call a hard Brexit, although I don't think it's a particularly good term. But we left the EU in that way because it gives us the maximum choices about the future. And that is what we tried to achieve in the last 18 months. And I think we've achieved that sort of optionality. The TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, does not constrain us in domestic choices in, I think, a sort of meaningful and significant way. And we always expected we would see gradual divergence begin to happen as soon as we're out of the transition period, out of the customs union, able to decide things a bit for ourselves. And I think you are seeing that begin to happen. And as I tried to say in my speech this morning, I think people somewhat underrate or undervalue or don't look at the many things that have already changed, as well as the ambitions we've got for the future. So I think that's sort of important framing to where we are. Second point, looking at the state of the relationship. We're not interested, although some people seem to think we are, we're not interested in kind of endless bad relations with the European Union. That wasn't the point of Brexit. We wanted to get to a situation of friendly relations, free trade, good relations between neighbours. And it's a sort of disappointment, I guess, that for a mix of reasons we're not there yet. But we can get there. We are not doing what we're doing for electoral reasons. I think there's a sense that some people have that we're kind of, playing to the gallery by taking a particularly tough position on various things, whether it's fisheries, Northern Ireland, or anything else. That's really not the case. We are doing the right thing, and I think most people in the country want to move on and look at what we're doing with Brexit rather than endlessly hear about negotiations of one kind or another. So we would like to get to a steady state and a better steady state as quick as we can. Third point on Northern Ireland, again, this is not about, the positions we're taking is not about kind of whipping up a sort of anti-EU hostility in any way. I think that'd be an incredibly irresponsible thing to do in that particular context. What we've got, again, as I tried to say this morning, is a very serious political problem in Northern Ireland that there are many causes of. And one can spend as long as one wishes going through the different causes and the sort of relativities, but it only takes you so far. We've got a serious political problem, and at the moment we aren't getting a huge amount of help from the EU in resolving it. They are necessarily a player because of the protocol, and I hope that might change over the next couple of weeks or so. It does need to be resolved, though, this autumn, one way or another, as I said, whether it's through negotiations or through Article 16. Looking forward, fourth point, looking at the economy, I personally think we are seeing the beginnings of a shift to a sort of new British economic model, if you like. I don't think there's anything particularly revolutionary about the model. We don't have to sort of rush it, it's happening. And I think it offers some signs of being able to deal with the productivity problem we've had in recent years. So what am I doing? We're doing the review of EU law that I announced last month. And the crucial thing is to find a new mechanism to deal with all the laws that were brought onto our statute books without meaningful democratic scrutiny in any way. An EU regulation applied by direct effect is now on our statute book, yet nobody in our Parliament voted for it. So we need to find ways of dealing with that sort of weight of history. And we are identifying, what's the next phase of reforms for third session, fourth session of this Parliament. The things we can do to continue to change things, and that's my responsibility. Last point, I think it's a good moment to build a constituency for change in this country. People voted for change in 2016. And whether we wished it or not, a lot of things have happened since then. The pandemic has obviously forced everyone to rethink quite a few things. A lot of things that worked in the past won't work in the future, and I think it's a good moment to sort of get ahead of that, tap into the energy, try and generate momentum for change and for things to be done differently, rather than return to where we are before. And I think we can do that, and that's what we plan to do. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. Arlene, you take the floor.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. To go back to the Brexit referendum, I believed in Brexit because I had been the Minister for the Economy in Northern Ireland for over 7 years, and I seen the way in which the European Union really put a slow hand on the development of our economy. It slowed down innovation and entrepreneurship, and I believed very much so in the agenda of Global Britain and to move forward in that way. 2 years ago, I was here in this very hall speaking with the Prime Minister. The slogan at that time, of course, was "Get Brexit Done." And that was the real momentum that was really developing at that time, and I absolutely acknowledge that to be the case. But of course, for those of us who live in Northern Ireland and who are proud British citizens, Brexit isn't done. And it's not done because of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And the Northern Ireland Protocol, and David will keep me right on this, and I hope I am right on this, was really for two reasons. It was to protect the European Union single market from Northern Ireland being used as a backdoor into that European market. But of course, if anybody knows about the trade flows in Northern Ireland, the risk to the EU single market is absolutely minuscule. But yet we have this huge disproportionate regime of checks and regulatory alignment, and it's causing real and tangible damage to the Northern Ireland economy. Why? Because most of our supply chains are east-west, as you would expect, within the United Kingdom, the internal market of the United Kingdom, and therefore the Northern Ireland Protocol is causing huge damage in respect of that. The second reason that the protocol was to come about was we were told to protect the Belfast Agreement. It's doing the opposite, folks. It's doing the opposite. It's actually causing great damage to relationships internally in Northern Ireland, and indeed north-south between ourselves and the Republic of Ireland, and that's because the east-west relationship has been fractured. So the equilibrium, the balance that we talk about in Northern Ireland politics has been greatly disturbed by the Northern Ireland Protocol. And in an art gallery not too far away from here, every single unionist leader from Northern Ireland are currently together saying that the protocol has to go or there will be huge consequences for stable government in Northern Ireland, and that's very, very concerning. So I do welcome the fact that we had the command paper back in July of this year. And in that command paper, it is acknowledged that the conditions are there to trigger Article 16 because of the damage that has been done. But I also understand, having been the First Minister of Northern Ireland, that David and his team want to get to a negotiated settlement. I acknowledge that. But time is running out. The European Union have known now for a considerable period of time that there are difficulties in Northern Ireland. They haven't acknowledged those difficulties, despite the fact that David has been telling them about those difficulties for some time now. And you cannot shy away from the conclusion, for me it's an inevitable conclusion, that the European Union, a bit like when David Cameron went and looked for reform of the European Union, he was told, you answer that with more Europe. When we go and talk about the Northern Ireland Protocol, the answer is more protocol. That's what you're given. And it's almost as if the European Union is punishing the United Kingdom for having the temerity to leave the European Union, and also send a message to other countries about what will happen if you leave the European Union. So I'm afraid it's not a pretty picture at the moment. I commend David for his efforts to find a way forward in relation to this issue, but I also say very clearly, the circumstances are there. They've been there right throughout the year for triggering Article 16. So why are we waiting? Thank you very much.
Well, perhaps I'll pose that question to Lord Frost a little later, but let's hear from Martin now.
Thanks, Stephen. This is going to feel a bit like a handbrake turn after that, after Arlene's contribution, because I'm going to talk about the 10% of businesses in the UK that export. Now that means there are over 5 million that don't. And we think it's absolutely vital that we find ways of encouraging more businesses to export, given that we're now branding ourselves as Global Britain. And one of the biggest problems is, I think, we've neglected this idea that there's a funnel of businesses that learn at grassroots level how to export and then gradually become more and more sophisticated and more successful. And one of the factors that control that is the factor that most businesses before used the EU as a bit of a nursery for exporting. It was an easy place to export. It didn't feel like exporting. And that meant that you had about 90% of UK exporters were exclusively exporting to the EU. And we've got to find ways of galvanizing them to look elsewhere. And I think the biggest factor is that currently we've got 20% of businesses that have decided that, frankly, it's just too hard, and they've switched off. They've decided they're going to focus on the domestic market. And bizarrely, one of the reasons that are the friction that's been brought into the relationship with the EU. So I'm massively encouraged by what Lord Frost said, that we're not going to get into an endless relationship or bad relationship with the EU. We're going to find a way through this, because I think it is vitally important to to the success of this economy in the future. So what are the opportunities? Well, I honestly believe, and there's good evidence from what we've seen in our reports, that the trade show arrangements in the UK can be improved dramatically. If we look across at the Canadian model, instead of funneling everything through agents, they allow the individual businesses to decide what their priorities are, and that could be translation, it could be marketing, it could be research, but the money is focused on the businesses, and we think that would make a massive difference. Also, I think it's very important that small business chapters in these trade agreements are properly explored and marketed. I mean, it may come as a surprise to you, but most small business owners don't wake up every morning, look to see what opportunities there are in the latest trade agreement. that needs to be promoted. They need to understand the benefits of that. And also, I think there's a real opportunity, and I think everybody's mentioned it before, that we can now look at turning ourselves into a nation that can be much more nimble when it comes to regulation, and get rid of some of the thicket of regulations that slow down progress and innovation. You know, we have been big advocates that we think there is just simply too much regulation. It's the cumulative effect that really dampens down the enthusiasm of many small businesses in the UK. So I think there is room for optimism, and I hope the other speakers endorse that. Thank you.
Thank you. Gerard.
Stephen, thank you. It's a great honour, great pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'm going to focus on 3 areas: realising the need to change, second, the global context, and third, what I think we should do. As it's the afternoon, I'm going to start with some numbers. You need to have some numbers now and again. 32, 62, 100. Size of the world economy. $32 trillion, the size of the world economy at the beginning of this century. $62 trillion, the size of the world economy the day Lehman Brothers went bust. $100 trillion, the size of the world economy, according to the IMF next year. The world economy is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. 2 other figures, though, to put this in context. 2.4%, roughly 1.2%. The trend rate of growth of the British economy before the global financial crisis was around 2.4%. Economists might disagree slightly on the exact figure, but roughly 2.4%. Trend rate of growth of the UK economy now around 1.2%. An economy that grows at 2.4% doubles in size in 32 years. One that grows at 1.2% doubles in size in 60 years. We're not growing much. The rest of the world, or parts of it, are growing strongly. The need to change is evident. Brexit provides the opportunity. We had a political crisis here 2016 to 2019. We signed the withdrawal agreement. The last year and a half we've had the pandemic. So in some respects, now is the opportunity to have a renewed focus on post-Brexit Britain. And what does that mean? Leaving something you've been in for over 4 decades is not easy. We can see that clearly. At the same time, the very least we need is a mindset change. Now, leaving something like the EU requires us to have a good relationship with the EU, as Lord Frost pointed out in his second point. But it also means that leaving the EU does not tie our hands on our domestic agenda, nor should it tie our hands on our future global aspirations. Arlene Foster, who I had the pleasure of meeting for the first time today, I thought was spot on. She touched on a key point. That withdrawal agreement does tie our hands on the key part of our domestic agenda with respect to Northern Ireland. But in terms of other areas, thankfully, it doesn't. In terms of positioning with the rest of the world, we are in a good position. Leaving the single market was necessary to achieve our domestic future agenda. Leaving the customs union was vital to position ourselves globally. And Liz Truss, when she was cutting trade deals, was doing a great job. So first, realising the need to change. Second, the global context. The world economy is growing, and it's growing in dramatic ways. And the UK is very, very, very well placed if it actually realises it to seize that opportunity. One of the key global changes is the digital and data revolution. The US leads in tech, but one of the most significant developments only a few months after the Brexit referendum was when all the US tech companies decided, despite Brexit, to proceed with their investment in the UK, making the UK effectively the Silicon Valley for those companies outside of the US. Go to King's Cross, Camden Town, that whole area is transforming the gross value added, as economists would call it, of the London economy. We have a fintech city, financial technology. So the UK is in a good space. Realising the growth opportunities from our universities. The UK has more universities in the top 100 than the rest of Western Europe put together. This government is trying to commercialise some of the gains from the things we develop and research at universities. We need to do more. The shift in the balance of power is vital for us to realise. We now are seeing a trans-Pacific as opposed to a transatlantic global economy, from India in the west to America in the east, the Indo-Pacific. Policy Exchange should take a lot of credit for actually leading the policy debate in terms of how the UK should position itself in this Indo-Pacific. And finally, on this point, you might turn up at this conference and think the UK is the only country in the world that has high budget deficits. Global public debt is at an all-time high. All-time high. Countries across the globe have spent like there's no tomorrow. Central banks' balance sheets are expanded, some might say bloated. That means in terms of macroeconomic policy, there's little room for manoeuvre. What it does, though, imply is that the supply side agenda needs to and can come more and more to the fore. And that leads on to the third point about what we should do. Martin touched on it in terms of being nimble. At the very least, we need to have a vision for the future. We need to have a clearly articulated economic strategy, and that is still, in my view, yet to be fully flushed out. I think the pandemic has put us on the back foot for the last 18 months, but we're getting there. Therefore, that needs the buy-in that Lord Frost touched on in terms of his fifth point. When I worked for Boris Johnson as Mayor of London 2016 to 2012 to 16, remember one particular time pointing out to him how the UK could become the biggest economy in Western Europe in the next 25 years. I think we still have that opportunity, but becoming nimble is part of it. It's the whole supply side agenda, and Martin touched on it, but it's a lot of issues. It's all the I's. It's innovation, investment, infrastructure, and incentives. Incentives in terms of tax and regulation. Leaving the EU gives us so much more room for manoeuvre on the innovation side and on the incentive side. In terms of investment in infrastructure, you could argue we could have done a lot of that when we were in the EU, but at least now we force ourselves to really address it. And to conclude, it's not just what we're doing here at home, it's also the message we're conveying globally. I have a number of different hats. For instance, I'm on the board of Bank of China in the UK. I find it quite amazing when one goes to the other side of the globe that people rely, for instance, on the Financial Times and the BBC as the main voices of the UK. I'm not saying anything negative about either of those media, but it really reinforces the need for the UK, through its government, to actually get that global message out more clearly about what post-Brexit Britain means, both domestically and globally. So to conclude, I think we need to realise the need to change. I think we need to look at this in terms of the global context. And third, in terms of what we should do, I think there is a lot we can do, there's a lot we should do, and now we have left the EU and starting to embrace what that actually means. I think there's a lot we should expect ourselves to do. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So before I come to the audience, and please do think of some questions while we do the next few minutes. I'd like to give the panellists a chance to respond to each other if they like. And I think I might start by posing the question that Arlene posed to Lord Frost. I guess, and you mentioned this in your speech this morning, that the government is presenting legal text to the EU. So what is the kind of the diplomatic process from here in terms of, as you see it, in terms of resolving the situation with the protocol?
So yeah, we've been preparing legal text for some time, but my worry is that the process has got a bit slow. You know, we did our command paper back towards the end of July. We're now at the beginning of October. We still haven't had a sort of considered response from the EU. So I think we need something to kind of move it along a bit and try and speed it up. I am hopeful we'll get something from the EU soon, and we can get into a genuinely intensive talks process with them. To answer Arlene's question, which I think is sort of relevant here, why aren't we using Article 16 now? I think the answer is it comes back to what I was saying in my opening remarks. Is it's better to have good relations if we can. and we really need to test that. We need to test whether it is possible to come to a good negotiated solution. We need to test whether the EU can think twice about where they are and kind of raise the eyes to the horizon and do something better that puts in place a solution that we, will actually solve these problems. I don't think we can wait that long for it, as I was saying. These problems are extremely well worked over the last 5 years. There really isn't that much new stuff. The context has changed a lot, obviously. But I think we need a short, intensive and good faith talks process to happen quite soon. And as we come out of that, we'll know whether an agreement is possible or not. And if it's not possible, then obviously, we'll be looking at Article 16. But I think we need to try everything. We need to show that we've tried everything, and we need to see if it is possible to agree something, because then we can move on to a better relationship more generally. So that's what we'll try and do. Whether we can do it is sort of not really in our hands, unfortunately, but we'll try our best.
Arlene, do you have any comments on that or anyone else's intervention?
Well, I totally appreciate David's position on all of this. The difficulty, of course, is that we in Northern Ireland continue to feel the pain of the protocol. We continue to have big consumer bosses like the M&S chairman telling us that we're going to have less choice at Christmas. People may say, well, really, is that such a big issue? Actually, it is, because for me, the supply chains that come between GB and NI are fundamental to UK being in the Northern Ireland being in the UK, because what's happening at the moment is trade diversion, and people are looking to the Republic of Ireland and to Europe for their trade. And therefore that weakens the union, because of Article 6 of the Act of Union is the fact that we will have unfettered trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and indeed all of the constituent parts of the UK. So it is a really fundamental issue for those of us who live in Northern Ireland. May not impact, and I absolutely acknowledge it doesn't impact on people living in Great Britain, but it is the case that it is impacting on, for me, the most important part of the United Kingdom, but for those of you here, and a part of the United Kingdom that has been through so much. And for Europe, and for Michel Barnier to say very recently, I think his quote was, the Brits are going to have to understand that we're not going to renegotiate. Well, why then, and I think David made reference to this from the stage, why then is there Article 13.8 that talks about subsequent agreements? It talks about subsequent agreements. So why is there this reticence on their part to have those conversations that David has referred to and come to an agreement that doesn't do the damage to Northern Ireland that it's currently doing? That's the question I would have for the Europeans. What's the problem? Because that's within the protocol at the moment.
Okay, thank you. And Martin, I don't know if you wanted to sort of talk about any of the practical experience from business in terms of the protocol, and you mentioned you'd like to sort of see a thawing of the relationship. What are the kind of things that from a practical point of view, you'd like to see from a business?
The classic one is the VAT one-stop shop, and I know that sounds a bit obtuse, but what it means is that if I'm going to trade with the EU, I currently have to employ an intermediary in the EU to act on my issues, so that the EU is prepared to treat me as a one-stop shop for VAT. That adds significant costs to the average small business trying to trade with the EU. And the attitude that we've got back from EU officials is, well, this is essentially down to bad blood and because of the negotiations over the protocol. Everything gets tipped into this same bucket. Every time there's an issue, a practical issue that has a dramatic real-world effect on businesses operating both in the EU and Northern Ireland, it all comes down to, well, this running sore, which is the protocol, is poisoning everything.
Well, I think what we're hearing from the panel is that in terms of our title towards a new UK-EU relationship, I think a lot depends on what happens with the protocol in terms of moving on. Gerard, did you have any comments to make before we go to questions? Or
Well, it's interesting to hear the comments from the panel. The challenge before the 2016 referendum was that in the UK, I think we tended to view our relationship with the EU solely through economic and financial lens, whereas for the EU, it's a political project. And I think there's some elements of that in terms of the comments being made now. It's a very different perspective. So.
Yes, I think, in terms of the EU being kind of economic policy, but also now foreign policy for the UK, I think is something that is taking time to digest, both in the UK, but also I think within the European Union. So with that, let's go to questions from the audience. There's no question you can't ask, but please can tell me your name and your organisation. There's a gentleman in the first row here. I think there's a microphone on its way to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm James Crisp from the Daily Telegraph. The Northern Ireland Protocol, as it stands, means that Northern Ireland has to follow about 300 single market rules, if I've understood it correctly. I don't think there's anything in the command paper about that. We've been talking a bit about divergence and how mainland Britain can diverge, but Northern Ireland won't be able to get the benefits of that. How is that sustainable over the long term, given what we've been talking about? And I'll cheekily just ask a quick question to you, Lord Frost, specifically on Article 16. I mean, do you think this will all be over by Christmas? Thank you.
Wouldn't that be wonderful?
Well, I think maybe Lord Frost can answer both those questions initially.
Yeah, I'll have a go. I mean, the command paper model provides for something a bit novel, which is the idea that both UK and EU goods should be able to circulate sort of simultaneously in Northern Ireland to be able to sort of reflect the balance of four particular companies and where they trade and where their markets are, and we think that's perfectly workable as a way through this problem, and we'll have to see what the EU think about it. But it seems like it's as we've tried to make clear with the command paper, we're putting forward an ambitious compromise. We're trying to sort of work with the grain of things and deal with the problems that have arisen in a very significant way, but also deal with the very special context in Northern Ireland, and that was felt to be a kind of reasonable way of solving the problem. Let's see what we get back. Will it be over by Christmas? I think something will be over by Christmas.
So in effect, the command paper is proposing a sort of dual regulatory regime in effect, I think, as I understand.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So yeah. And Arlene, what's your take on that? Is that something that would satisfy the demands and sort of address the issues that you see in terms of the question of whether the UK is Northern Ireland is aligned completely with the EU, or whether there's more flexibility in there in terms of regulation?
Well, I mean, this thing comes down. It takes me back to conversations that we were having in 2018 around how we could deal with the border issue in Northern Ireland, and mistakenly Theresa May believed that the Belfast Agreement meant that there couldn't be a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Well, of course there's a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. There always has been. There's a currency border, there's a VAT border, there's a customs border. It's always been there. And I think that then was used by the Irish and the Europeans to really push in the direction that brought us to the protocol. So I accept that was the wrong trajectory was set at that point. And that meant then that we couldn't put forward what I thought were perfectly workable alternatives to what we have now in terms of using intelligence, in terms of using risk-led issues. So, for example, if you get a lasagna from Sainsbury's, there's not much chance of it leaking into the single market of the European Union because there are no Sainsbury's stores in the Republic of Ireland, number one, and it's marked in sterling. So, I mean, where's the risk in relation to that? And then, of course, there was the whole conversations about trusted traders, about smart borders, which, of course, was led by the European Union themselves. They did a piece of work on that and then completely disregarded it. So there were alternatives out there. I mean, we're always challenged that there is no alternative to the protocol. Of course there's alternatives to the protocol. It's just that the European Union wouldn't entertain the alternatives that were put to them at that particular point in time. So I think we need to revisit a lot of those issues to allow us then to return to the nimbleness that Martin talks about. And that's what I want to see. As I said, as an economy minister, the whole reason why I thought Brexit was a good thing for the UK was to allow us to be more innovative, more entrepreneurship, being allowed to grow in Northern Ireland. And because of what has happened, it's actually gone in the other direction.
Okay, thank you. Martin, I don't know if you want to come in on the business side in terms of the regulatory question.
What would worry me is that you get a sort of two-speed UK where different things are going to happen in Northern Ireland to the rest of GB. And I think that will put pressure on the union, inevitably, because talking to my members in Northern Ireland, they are increasingly trading north-south. And that will weaken the links with GB. I think that's inevitable.
Yeah, well, the key, regardless of your politics, in economics, the important thing is that incentives do work. And if you start to have a new system that incentivizes business to behave in a different way, then business will respond to those incentives. And if you're saying, Martin's saying this incentives is to go, should we say, north-south, as opposed to Northern Ireland to the rest of the UK, then eventually, if you leave that in place, that will have an impact on the economy. But in terms of the devolution agenda, it's interesting. When we were in the EU, the UK was ceding powers to Brussels all the time. Outside of the EU, and this argues for the union being kept together, is that Westminster is ceding powers to Cardiff, to Edinburgh, and to Belfast. So it's a very different relationship, the UK being in the EU, to Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales remaining within the UK. It's a sort of, the dynamic changes, and that should start to incentivise us to respond to this EU issue in a way that's maybe on the front foot. I should say that even though the debate here is on Northern Ireland, with the City of London hat on, there are a number of firms in the City of London who are encountering, shall we say, a European regulator or a regulator in various European countries who is approaching the issue of finance from a very political perspective. So we're seeing this permeate into other areas, even though your question was initially on Northern Ireland.
Could I just add, on one of those points, the trade diversion point? I mean, it definitely is happening. We're definitely seeing supply chains being reordered quite quickly. Trade between Northern Ireland and Ireland has gone up a lot in both directions. That's clear from our figures and from Irish figures. People do respond very quickly. Businesses do respond very quickly to incentives. And incidentally, the other area where you see this is trade movements from Ireland across GB into the rest of the EU, where the land bridge, so-called, has kind of collapsed in the first 9 months of this year. People have responded very quickly to that incentive. So that's one reason why we can't wait very long to solve this problem. Things are happening, and it isn't just theoretical.
Okay, thank you. Further questions? The gentleman in the second row here, I think a microphone is on the way. If you could just state your name and your affiliation.
Thank you. Jitendra Joshi with AFP. Question for Lord Frost. Just to go back to the time frame in the immediate future, whether Christmas or not, you said in your remarks that you hope for something to change over the next couple of weeks. Why that particular time frame? What are you expecting from the EU in that fortnight or so? And at the same time, you've cast doubt on their willingness to negotiate and to cooperate. So should we be looking at Article 16 being invoked sooner than later?
Well, just quickly on that point, I think I've reason to believe we will get some sort of response from the EU in the next couple of weeks. I think obviously it's the content of that response that's really important. I'm not sure how formal it's going to be, but I hope we can get something. As I said, after that we need an intensive talks process to see whether whatever is on the table can be made to work, and we will try that as intensively and rapidly and with as good faith as we possibly can, and we'll see where it takes us. It just has got to be intensive, and it's got to be serious, and it's got to be short.
Okay, thank you. I know Martin has to leave in sort of 10 or so minutes, so if you have any questions for Martin, please do raise your hand. But I've got a question in the last row there, the gentleman at the back.
Thanks. It's Joe Mays from Bloomberg. A question for Lord Frost and then one for the panel. For Lord Frost, would triggering Article 16 require passing domestic legislation to override the Withdrawal Act to provide a new legal basis for trade between GB and NI? And the question for the panel is, hasn't the UK effectively already triggered Article 16 de facto by unilaterally suspending parts of the protocol to prevent trade diversion, such as over delaying SPS checks?
So Article 16 is a very specific thing, and I don't think we can be said to have sort of suspended it de facto, used it de facto. You normally have a margin of appreciation when a new treaty comes into force, and on the EU side, not everything that in theory should have been done on the 1st of January in the TCA was in fact done. And we sort of slightly shrug our shoulders at that and say, well, they'll get round to it quite soon. In most cases, they have got round to it quite soon. We don't regard that as a kind of seismic event. It's just the way things are in the real world. And I think what we were doing with the grace periods and other things is more like that than anything else. It was simple, pragmatic issue. I think on the question of how do we use Article 16, I think that is something that I've heard people take different views on. I think I don't really want to get into the legalities of it now, but we're confident that when we need to act, we can do so quickly, and we will do. I say quickly, but not suddenly, and not sort of out of the blue. Signalling certainty, predictability are really important here, but we're confident we can do it.
Okay. Anyone else have anything on that? No. Any other questions from the audience? The gentleman at the back there, I think, microphone is on the way to you, and the gentleman here as well.
Thank you, Chairman. Alan Cheeseman, Sevenoaks. It seems to me over the last, maybe a year, but certainly over the last few months, the EU has not been winning the argument within its own borders with the 27, and is constantly and increasingly reverting to threat and intimidation and litigation with its own members. And that clearly is what they're doing with us in terms of the protocol. I do feel that they will only react to threat and litigation, and I do feel that we need to invoke Article 16 sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Okay. I'm not sure there was a question in there, but I think the question that I think that does allude to is sort of how does this relationship improve? I mean, I think we are clearly in a very difficult, sticky moment now around the protocol, understandably so. But if we are able to move through that, where would a longer term relationship with the EU that is constructive and fruitful, what would that look like? Because I think one of the things that is conspicuously absent from the TCA, I guess, is a sort of a broader political element in terms of cooperation on things such as foreign policy and security, and we've heard that the EU might be interested in that, and the UK decided not to go down that route. Is that something that would be open to in the longer term, or is that something that we're still kind of thinking about?
So I think a couple of things. One, slightly in answer to both questions, I think one of the problems is for the EU that they don't have a model for dealing with neighbours in Europe that aren't members of the European Union and don't want to be. Their model is all about extending EU law and extending their ways of doing things and assuming everyone shares their aspirations. And it isn't working for us. It hasn't actually. It's sort of run into the sand with other neighbours as well. And I do think the EU needs to sort of think constructively about how it deals with what's now quite a large periphery, with a lot of which it has relatively bad relations with, and find some better way. And that takes two, and obviously it'd be good to have creative discussions about that. But at the moment it feels rather unconstructive, and not just about us either. I think the best thing we could do, actually, is to grow faster than the EU and reform quicker than the EU and show that things are working better in the UK, and that will be more powerful than any number of kind of committees and forums. The power of example is very strong, and that's the path, as Gerard was sort of alluding to, we've got to get onto if we're going to show that Brexit was worth it as it was.
Yeah. Well, Lord Frost talked about the EU political model maybe being open to question. Certainly, the EU economic model, like the UK economic model, needs to change to reflect the changing global economy. Now, the UK can't tell the EU what to do. So for us, it's about controlling the controllables. But in terms of that relationship with the EU, we need a robust relationship. Maybe defence, security, intelligence is on one side, but when it comes to economics, finance and trade, I think we need to actually be very much trying to, as you say, lead by example, but control the controllables, bring more things back under our own control. Take the finance, for instance. In the 60s, the UK became the offshore centre for the euro-dollar market. In those days, the euro was referred to as an international, so it's the international dollar market. That's because the City of London became competitive. The US was actually burdening itself with taxes. The EU is effectively trying to put up barriers, fragment the European capital markets. The UK, therefore, needs to say, if that's what you want to do, you want to grant equivalence to America, not to us, even though regulatorily we were the same, that's your decision. Equivalence is not the end of the day. Therefore, we're going to have a deregulation agenda, and we're effectively going to become the offshore centre for the euros. We've become the euro market now. Basically, we can't tell the EU what to do. They're naturally free to pursue whatever path they want. But there are lots of things we now have, lots of levers under our control that we should start to use. Clearly, there are many areas globally where the UK can set the agenda. There are many areas where we will cooperate with the EU, environment being one example. But there are other areas, and I think on business, it's quite clear, there are things that we should be doing sooner rather than later.
Martin, I don't know if you have time, but if there's a few points that you'd like to make in terms of Gerard's point about what are the things that we can control, that we can do that can make the difference?
I think the most important thing I would emphasise is we all are not that typical of your average small business leader. They don't follow the twists and turns of Article 16 and what's going on with the protocol. So if you're going to make a dramatic change, and this will be dramatic, just make sure people are well aware of the implications and prepared for it, because I think it could have a damaging effect as well as a beneficial effect.
I think there was a gentleman here who was asking a question.
Very briefly,
So 1 second, if you wait for the microphone just for the benefit of our online audience.
Councillor Julian Gallant, Ealing Broadway, Ealing Council. Question: were we ready? Were we ready for what the EU did post-agreement? Were we prepared for that? Did they catch us take us by surprise? And are we ready for what they'll do if we invoke Article 16?
So you're referring to the when the EU invoked...
Were we prepared, and are we ready for what they're going to do?
Yeah. Okay. I think Lord Frost might be the first one to attempt that.
So I mean, I think. Obviously, the middle of the pandemic was a period when everybody was, the past wasn't a reliable guide to the future in all kinds of ways, and in a way, it's not surprising that unusual things happened. I was a bit surprised by the EU's move on Article 16 at the end of January, and particularly the suggestion that, having told us for 5 years you couldn't put any sort of trade process across the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, all of a sudden you could. And that I think that element of it's been sort of forgotten. It wasn't just about Article 16. It was the sort of the basis for why things were done in the way that they'd be done in the protocol suddenly no longer seemed to matter when it was important to the EU to do it in a different way. So I was surprised by that, honestly. Maybe I was, maybe I should have seen it coming, given the last 18 months. But I think it was a shock, and it did inject a huge jolt to the system, and just kind of destroyed a lot of the basis on which we've been trying to proceed. And that is we just got to deal with the consequences of that. I assume that if we do use Article 16, the EU would look to retaliate. I mean, I hope they don't, because I don't think it's necessary. We're dealing with a political situation, and beginning a sort of trade retaliation on the back of that doesn't necessarily help. I guess they probably would, but the unity of the country is paramount, obviously, and we have to proceed on that basis.
Arlene, I'm sure you have something to say on that.
Well, I remember the shock as well when they triggered said they were going to trigger Article 16 back in January of last year. I remember telephoning the Prime Minister, who was equally as shocked, David, at that time. And of course, they hadn't even spoken to the Taoiseach either about the fact that they were going to do that, so he was in shock. And it was all about vaccines at that time, you'll recall, and about the fact that they felt that they weren't getting their way in relation to the supply of vaccines for the European Union, and they took that action. I mean, at the moment, under the protocol, we do come to a bit of a cliff edge at the end of this year in relation to really important medicines coming into Northern Ireland, and they're being quite truculent about that, although I think it's probably one of the things that they will come back with to David, that they will allow medicines to come through from Great Britain into Northern Ireland without the checks a la the protocol. So look, I think geopolitics plays a huge role in all of this. We've seen the reaction of France and others to the AUKUS deal, and the way in which they reacted to that, even though they didn't have the technology that was needed for Australia to move forward. They have decided that this is just horrendous and that it's an awful indictment of global Britain and all the rest of it. But actually, they are going to have to come to terms with the fact that we are in a different place now, to David's point about how do you deal with countries that aren't in the European Union and do not want to be in the European Union, that we are neighbours of the European Union. So, of course, we have to have good relationships. But I have to say to you, for those of us from Northern Ireland, there has been a complete deaf ear to those of us who are trying to say, look, unless you take some action in relation to this, there are going to be consequences for the Northern Ireland peace process. None of us want to be in that position. So you really need to help us to get out of this. The answer that comes back, you signed the protocol, that's the way it is, nada. So we need to move on. We definitely do.
Okay. I think I spotted another hand here, yes, in the front row. Okay, sorry, yes.
Thank you, Joe Barnes of the Telegraph. Just to Lord Frost, could you discuss a little bit about the challenges you think you face in convincing the EU that the protocol is not working? And say Arlene will be able to kind of chime in on this, because it's a growing narrative on the continent that the protocol is working, and they're referring to things like the fuel trouble in mainland Britain that hasn't apparently emerged in Northern Ireland, and the Nando's shortages that we kind of suffered on mainland Britain and not in Northern Ireland. It's just work out, can you actually convince the European Union that the protocol isn't working on the ground when they clearly think that, as Maros Sefcovic kind of explains, that it's good for businesses because there's jams on both sides of the bread? Thank you.
If only.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what evidence they want, and actually, I don't think they are in quite the same position institutionally to where they were. I mean, you definitely hear people saying what you've said, obviously, but 6 months ago, people said that the institutional response of the Commission was the correct solution is to implement the protocol, and the problem is that you're not implementing it in full. As Arlene says, end of story. I think they have moved on a bit from that, and you now don't really hear the Commission denying there are problems. They just don't have the same view of what the best way forward is. And I think, my view is that, there are all sorts of sort of societal political problems that we've seen through the year. I think the command paper, my impression is, though, Arlene, you know better than me, my impression is that the command paper sort of struck people as a good way forward to try and see if we could negotiate, and that's for the time being taken a bit of the heat out of the situation. But as soon as it becomes clear, if it does become clear that we can't, then we will be back in the same situation. And I think it's fundamentally wrong to say, we must have things actually going wrong before we're allowed to do anything about them. I think that's quite a risky thing to say in the Northern Ireland context.
And I mean, trade diversion is happening, David, and you have all of the evidence of that. So, I mean, the protocol is very clear that actually, if it leads to serious economic, societal or environmental difficulties or a diversion of trade, and the diversion of trade is very clearly happening, and the economic and societal difficulties are there as well. So, yeah, I don't know what other evidence they need, really.
Okay, and sorry, the lady here and lady there as well. We'll take both questions now, actually, because we've got sort of 5-6 minutes to go. So.
Hi, Liz Piper from Reuters. Sorry to bang on about Article 16, but it is the topic of the moment. You said that you'd be able to act quickly, but not suddenly and not out of the blue. Does that mean there's some kind of warning before you trigger? And how early could you trigger? Are we talking November, maybe, end of November, if these intensive talks don't materialise?
Okay, let's take the other question now as well here, and then come back to the panel.
Hi, Sophie Mew from Eurotunnel. We represent a significant proportion of UK-EU trade, including customers who are desperate to use the land bridge both to Northern Ireland and the Republic. But we're seeing significant difficulties with customers complying with regulations such as safety and security declarations, but lots of these have been directly transposed from EU legislation. My question to the panel is, what can be done to reduce the burden to those businesses to make sure that they are able to do the trade that they want to do across the land bridge?
Okay, thank you. Arlene, do you want to go first this time?
Yeah, well, I absolutely feel for those small businesses who actually believed that Brexit would give them simplicity in terms of forms, and actually what they've been confronted with has been more regulatory burden. I know small companies who have had to employ somebody just to engage with the burden that has been placed upon them by the protocol, and that is completely wrong and not the reason why we wanted to leave the European Union. It was the opposite of that. So I'm hoping that if we get a solution in relation to the protocol, that we will see that moving on. I don't think that, look, if people wanted to bring goods through the land bridge of Northern Ireland, there was a way to deal with that. If you come into Belfast Port, then if you're coming just into Northern Ireland with your goods, you go straight through. If you're coming and you're going on into the Republic of Ireland, then you can deal with it through a process there. That should be the way it happens. And unfortunately, that isn't the way that it's happening at the moment. All of the goods that come into Northern Ireland are subject to these regulations, and that's wrong.
Perhaps Gerard next, and I'll come back to you.
Yeah, I don't think I can answer directly either of those questions. I think they're very much for the Minister. I thought they were very good questions. But let me step back, because it's not obviously just about Northern Ireland, as important as that is. From an economic perspective, during the referendum campaign, I referred to it as a Nike swoosh. It was very difficult to quantify fully the impact of leaving the EU. But I was trying to portray that if you leave something you've been in for 4 decades or over 4 decades, there is undoubtedly going to be some disruption, particularly if not everyone buys in to leaving. And then once you get over that initial stage, then the path should be, I'm not going to use the word rosy, but very constructive, very positive. But it's not just leaving, it's what you actually do. I would say there's no doubt that the withdrawal agreement, as we're hearing, has imposed challenges in terms of Northern Ireland. And those clearly need to be respected, addressed and taken seriously. But in terms of the rest of the UK, there are lots of constructive, positive areas that we can move on. In fact, Stephen, you did a report for Policy Exchange on deregulation. There was an IDS and others report this summer. It's not just about deregulating, though. It's about trying to embrace innovation, investment, infrastructure spending, and also getting those incentives right. So I think what we're seeing with Northern Ireland is an example of how there are challenges when you leave something. But at the same time, I think, in terms of the whole UK approach, I think we need to have a clear strategy, clear vision, and I think we should be constructive about it. In terms of just what's happened the last few years, even with a pandemic, employment levels in the UK are really high. If we look back to what the Treasury was saying in 2016, it was quite remarkable. We would lose at least 500,000 jobs within 2 years. Didn't happen. If you actually look at the City of London in the strong position. So I think we need to, there's a mindset change as well as policy change that we need to have. And thankfully now it's occurring, but I think there's a lot more that needs to be done.
Thank you. And Lord Frost, if you could answer those questions and any other sort of concluding remarks you'd like to make, I think we can
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I think just quickly on the questions, I think Article 16, there's a process for using it that obviously we would abide by, and I think you we need to provide the maximum possible predictability and certainty for everyone who is trading and making their living in and around Northern Ireland. That's sort of obvious. So I think it's not the right thing to act randomly. It's the right thing to act predictably so people can adjust to it. I think that is really important. The question about the border, I think we should be doing things that are right for us. I agree, it's sort of copy across of EU legislation. It's kind of where we are at the moment, though. With the review of it, we will hopefully, begin to change things. But, it's very important we don't get into the mentality of just because they do it, we should do it. We should do what's best for us, for our country, and if others choose not to, well, we just have to live with that. We should control things that have to be controlled. Can I make just one final comment, picking up what Gerard said right at the start, actually, is the importance of growth and productivity in this question, and sometimes it gets forgotten. And we need to show that this country is growing faster and more productively than others. I see some of the sort of pathologies of a slow growth society around us, and the growth has been relatively slow for the last sort of 10, 15 years. Kind of competition for rents, and an environment where it's more worth kind of lobbying the government than it is to go out and earn your own living and make things happen. And we need to sort of change that. I think it's drifted a bit. We've drifted a bit into it. I think what worries me more about anything the EU than anything the EU could do to us is what we do to ourselves. And I worry most of all about sort of some of the sort of bad ideas, the anti-growth ideas that are around at the moment, sort of general kind of, localism, anti-flight, anti-car, anti-technology, a general sort of miserablism about the world and kind of human potential to solve problems. And I think we really need a mindset change on that. We can solve our own problems. We don't need to be in this slough of despond. Technology, human ingenuity can solve these things, and we now have the tools to get on with that, and we should.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you on that sort of upbeat, positive note. Please show your appreciation on behalf of Policy Exchange. Thank you to all our panellists. Thank you very much.